Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second of our webinar in this international speaker series that we're doing. This afternoon, we're really lucky and proud to have two really extraordinary scholars in the field of jihadism and the study of the Islamic State with us today, Dr. Craig Whiteside and Dr. Haroro Ingram. I'd like to first start our webinar by just an acknowledgement and paying our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet on different places here as we meet virtually, and also welcome our speakers and welcome our attendees. The purpose of this webinar is to hear from Craig and Haroro on their new publication, fantastic publication called The ISIS Reader, the milestone texts of the Islamic State movement. Now, it seems as if, just as the world has kind of started to move on from this unrelenting focus on the Islamic State, sure enough, just as we know about this group, we're starting to hear more and more about what they're doing back into the mainstream focus. But of course, as we know, many of the scholars like Haroro, like Craig, and many of us here on this webinar who have been following the movement know that they have not gone anywhere, and that they're still a viable force, but clearly one that has transformed, that has differentiated from its heyday as a proto-state. So with that, I just wanted to offer a very brief introduction because I want to spend most of this hour giving time to both Craig and Haroro to discuss their book, to discuss the findings, how they went about doing the research. But just to let you know that this Islamic State Reader, it highlights, the premise of it is that it highlights 15 official texts by the most influential leaders of the Islamic State movement. And they made an interesting choice to actually start all the way back in 1994, which for some of us taking a look at the Islamic State, we would say, well, the organization didn't start then. But I thought that that was a very interesting choice and hopefully something you can speak to about why you decided to start looking at influential texts from the mid-90s onward. And through the analysis of this text, through the transcription, the analysis, and the contextualization of these texts, they start to give us a picture of the life cycle of the movement and also an insight into their strategy and to their doctrine. And hopefully it can also offer us, and I'm sure it will, this really foundational book that they've put forward, a window or an insight into, by understanding their foundational texts, where the Islamic State movement could potentially go as it adapts to its current conditions. So with that, like I said, I don't want to talk too much, but I would like to offer a brief introduction to the two scholars that are with us today. We have Haroro Ingram, who's a senior research fellow at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. He is one of the co-authors of the ISIS Reader, and his primary research focus is on the role of propaganda and charismatic leadership in non-state political movements. And we have Dr. Craig Whiteside, who is an associate professor at the U.S. Naval War College. It's part of the resident program in the postgraduate school in Monterey. He's also a senior associate with the Center on Irregular Warfare and Armed Groups. And I think both of them are very well known to the research community for their work on the Islamic State movement. I should also mention that they also wrote this book with another colleague who's also very well known to the research community, Charlie Winter, who unfortunately, because of juggling time zones where US, Australia, and London couldn't join us today, but I'm sure that Craig and Haroro are more than capable of offering us a summary of their findings and insight into their work. And so with that, I'll leave it to you. Craig, Haroro, which one would like to kick off?
I think Haroro's up first, but I'll go ahead and share the slides if that's all right.
That's great. And just also before you start, I'm just going to offer a housekeeping note. If everyone could just leave their microphones on mute during the presentation part of the portion of this webinar. And then we'll also be sure to leave room for some Q&A at the end. I'm sure we'll have a few of those as well. So over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and good afternoon to everybody who's tuned in. And we really do appreciate your time. And particular thanks, of course, to Lydia and Vivian and Michelle and the broader Avert Research Network and Deakin University for the opportunity Today, I guess to offer our reflections on the Islamic State threat in 2020 and our assessment on how we've assessed that it's likely to evolve into the future. Now, we intend to speak for about 40 minutes, reflecting on our experiences in the field, working with communities, governments and militaries across the Middle East and Asia, but also on the findings from our recently released book, The ISIS Reader, and a forthcoming article. It's actually out on November the 18th, published by the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. And so we're going to talk through some of those findings before opening up for Q&A. Now, having just published a book that essentially tells the inside history of the Islamic State movement from its founding in the 1990s to the death of Baghdadi last year, it's only natural, I suppose, that we would point to history. These strategic, operational, and ideological trends that have emerged over time and in a sense kind of created these grooves and these habits of practice and culture in the organization. It's only natural that we would look at those and try to use them as the foundation for understanding the present and projecting into the future. And that, of course, is essential. And our argument, and really central concept in our book, is that the more that we broaden our historical aperture, not limiting ourselves to, say, 2014 or limiting ourselves to 2007, but the more that we can broaden that historical aperture, the more likely it is that we draw on a deeper pool of precedents, a deeper pool of trends that can help to shape our understanding. But it's also important for us to consider that the Islamic State in 2020 faces some really unique opportunities and challenges that it has not previously faced. One in particular is that it, of course, declared its so-called caliphate, led by a caliph, its top leader. And this has really significant implications that we need to consider for expectation management issues, how it engages with its broader supporter base, but also how it engages with its foes. The jurisprudential case that it presents to the world, to supporters, and also to followers. This declaration affects the kind of criteria for inclusion under its umbrella. And perhaps most importantly, this declaration fundamentally shaped the way in which the group and its leaders sought to project its authority. And another important trend, which is actually quite unique to the contemporary Islamic State, is that it needs to manage a transnational enterprise. It is operationally present in a couple of dozen countries around the world. When it initially expanded globally in 2013 into Syria, and that kind of snowballed after that, it created a lot of tensions within the organization. And it's our argument that these two factors in particular have presented some unique opportunities and challenges for the organization, for the movement, which it will need to manage in different ways. And we'll discuss that in more detail over the next 40 minutes or so. And so I guess it's for this reason that we suggest that it's important to take into account a mix of historical, strategic, and organizational trends. Craig, if you could change the slide. And it's this kind of exploration of this interplay of historical, strategic, and organizational dynamics that we're going to focus on. And it's essentially how we've structured the next 40 to 45 minutes into those three parts. Beginning with those historical trends, talking about the strategic and organizational trends that have emerged in a contemporary sense, and then building on parts 1 and 2 to present, I suppose, a framework of counter-strategy implications. If you could just change the slide again. Now, much of what we'll be talking about in part 1 is based on the ISIS Reader, which was published this year by Hurst in the UK and by Oxford University press in the US. But there is also an article that was published in January by West Point's CTC Sentinel. It's up on the screen there. It's free and it kind of contains a lot of the analysis which we're going to speak about today. So yeah, for those of you who are interested in digging into the detail, those are the two publications. Now, if we go to the next slide, there are three historical trends which Craig and I want to focus on today because of their implications for how we understand, or perhaps how we should understand, the Islamic State in 2020 and beyond. And to move to the first trend, this concerns the Islamic State's leadership succession practices since the death of the movement's leader and founder, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, in 2006. And these leadership succession practices are actually really important for understanding how the organization projects not only the authority of its leaders, but the authority of its broader politico-military religious agenda as well. And so to understand these leadership succession practices, it's necessary for us to take a step back and consider these broader issues of how the Islamic State seeks to project its authority as a movement, but also the authority of its top leaders. Now, Zarqawi is the founder of the Islamic State movement. Its origins are in the 1990s, and like so many other kind of organizations, it's quite common that a charismatic figure would emerge to lead a nascent organization. Now, Zarqawi had a reputation as a charismatic figure of being kind of young, brash, and violent. He positioned himself, particularly once the group had moved to Iraq, he presented himself as kind of the face of the group, as the image of the organization. Now, the thing about charisma is that it is an emotion-based leader-follower relationship. Now, this may sound overly academic and technical, but it's actually very, very important for understanding the authority claims and its implications. Charisma as an emotion-based leader-follower bond, it's useful to kind of contrast it, I guess, with legal rational and traditional forms of authority. So legal rational forms of authority are based on a legal process, whereas traditional bonds are kind of based on practice over time. Now, the thing about charismatic leadership is that it tends to be quite a volatile form of leadership, and it requires kind of constant, or at least regular, engagement between the leader and target audiences and the broader supporter base. Now, this type of leadership kind of characterizes nascent groups, organizations that have just formed, that are trying to establish itself. But as a group matures, as a movement matures, and it transitions, and it seeks to formalize its activities, charismatic leaders can actually become a problem for organizations. And this was essentially what faced the Islamic State as it sought to bureaucratize its governance activities, conventionalize its use of violence, particularly through 2006 into 2007. And so that strategic pivot that was going on, where it was essentially trying to move from an insurgency into what would become known as the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI, there was this issue at the top in terms of how it was going to project its leadership. Zarqawi didn't have any religious qualifications. He did not have a Qurayshi lineage to the Prophet. And frankly, he was a very volatile kind of figure at the front. He probably got to a point where he caused more problems for the group than he was a benefit. Perhaps fortuitously, at least for the Islamic State, he was killed in June 2006, and in October, the Islamic State in Iraq was established. And what you see at this historical kind of juncture for the movement is On the one hand, the death of its charismatic leader and founder, and the need to implement a stable process of leadership rapinization, of leadership succession. And on the other hand, the strategic and organizational transitions that were necessary to establish its state. Now, replacing a charismatic leader with another charismatic leader is a very kind of volatile, it's an intangible kind of process, or it typically is. It doesn't help stabilize an organization. What you see in the aftermath of Zarqawi's death is a structured designation process emerges in which the Shura Council selects an individual to become leader based on some core criteria. For example, that they have battlefield experience, that they have jurisprudential qualifications, that they have a Qurayshi tribal lineage. And what you see is that the leader at the top of this movement becomes characterized by, I guess, a fusion of legal, rational, and traditional form of authority rather than charismatic. When the leader emerges to the top, they are given a kunya upon their ascent. And unlike Zarqawi, the Islamic State's top leaders have taken a back seat. They are not really the image of the organization. You don't see them out front. That is a role that was kind of transitioned to the spokesman for the media unit. I think this is a really important part of the way in which the Islamic State looked to project its leaders and project their authority. This was not necessarily about the person and their charisma, but rather the position. And this really laid the foundations for the kind of claims that they would make in 2014 when they announced the caliphate with their leader as the caliph. This is the leadership succession process that saw Abu Umar al-Baghdadi replace Zarqawi. It saw Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi replace Abu Umar in 2010. And just last year, Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurayshi replaced Abu Bakr in 2019. Now, there are advantages to this type of approach. When your top leader is not the face of the organization, it is far easier, comparatively easier, I should say, to keep them secure, to protect them. Giving them a kunya helps to place emphasis on the position rather than the person, which helps to reinforce those broader arguments about the nature of this movement's authority, or at least their authority claims. But, you know, once that leader is designated, not only are they given a kunya, but typically you don't hear much from them for a period of time. And this really is an opportunity to help shape the image and narrative of that leader, the strategy behind how that leader is going to be projected to the world before you actually present them. So there are some advantages to this approach. And I hope it's clear how it kind of synchronizes with the Islamic State's broader claims. It's also a vulnerability, and this is really important for the field, particularly the field of practice, to recognize that this isn't a zero-sum game here, that while there may be strengths to a certain strategy, there might be certain advantages, there are inevitably vulnerabilities that come with that as well. And so what are some of the vulnerabilities that come with this approach to leadership succession? Well, the Islamic State have been open to very significant criticism on this point. This idea that this is an unknown leader being selected by unknowns, these unknown cabal that sits on this kind of a Shura council. It's important to recognize that when people pledge, they pledge to the caliph, not to the caliphate. And so that ends up becoming a point of contention as well. Well, these pledges to Qurayshi, for example, who are these people around the world actually pledging to when they don't know who that individual is? The other vulnerability, which I think has been potentially exposed this year regarding Qurayshi, is that if the identity of the individual is revealed before the Islamic State reveals it, it creates an opportunity for that image, how that leader is perceived, to be shaped by their adversaries. Many of you may be aware that the US West Point released tactical interrogation reports from the individual you see in the bottom corner there, Haji Abdullah. It was essentially al-Mawla's interrogation reports. And what emerged was that he basically ratted out on his fellow ISI members in 2007. And so this idea of giving the top leader a kunya, keeping them behind the scenes, developing how they're going to be presented to the world, this can become a vulnerability if they are identified first. And essentially that is what is very likely to have happened in the case of al-Mawla. The second trend, if we just go to the next slide, concerns how the Islamic State uses propaganda to forecast its strategic pivots. I'm not going to speak on this point for very long because Craig is going to go into this in a lot more detail. But this isn't unique for the Islamic State. Wallace Carroll's excellent book, Persuade or Perish. Carroll was the Office of War Information's deputy director during World War II. In Persuade or Perish, he offers these reflections on the struggle against Nazi propaganda. And in the text, one of the lessons that kind of emerges is the importance of propaganda analysis for identifying strategic shifts in the adversary, for gauging the way in which the adversary may be perceiving their current kind of status and posture. And the Islamic State is really no different. Analyzing Islamic State propaganda over a long period of time kind of demonstrates these kind of trends in their operations and strategies. And when you then overlay their propaganda calls over that, what you actually see is the way that propaganda was used, in a sense, to prepare its audience for transitions up and down the phases of its strategy. So think about Baghdadi in April 2013 with his announcement of the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham, where he not only maps out the group's history, but he then projects their future ascent. Fast forward to Adnani's final speech in, I think it was May 2016, and you have one of the earliest signs that the group knew that things weren't trending well for them, operationally and strategically. That Adnani, in a sense, was reminding target audiences that the group may have to move back down into its insurgency phase. And so by the time of Baghdadi's final speech in 2019, what you see presented to the world is the guerrilla caliph. Now, a reason why the group is able to use propaganda in this way really leads to the next trend, which Craig will discuss now. So, thanks, Craig.
Thank you. Thanks, Haroro. And thanks for having me. It's still Veterans Day here in California, Remembrance Day. So thanks to all the veterans out there. And a special shout out to the diggers who served with me in Iraq and working against the early Islamic State. So trend 3, learning from defeat, blueprints for success. One of the reasons we wrote the ISIS Reader was to look at things from their perspective, to look at their models, their understanding, their doctrine, if you will, identify their strategies, and try to explain them contextually in the ISIS Reader. And we'll try to give you some idea. This is how they depicted it in Dabiq. So they actually telegraphed some of this information. It's a general model, and steps 4 and 5, Tamkeen and the Khalifa, are where they were able to actually develop techniques and tactics that others had not been able to do before them. And they have kind of institutionalized some of the learning from this, and is what they're exporting to their global franchises, as we'll talk about. So their insurgency doctrine is pretty unique to them. It borrows from the usual suspects That includes jihadist theorists as well, but I'm pretty confident it is original to them, and that should make sense. They've been fighting nonstop since 2002. They've learned a few things as a movement, regardless of what they've been called along the way. Right, their current leadership are veterans of this early fight. The management of savagery is often mentioned as a heuristic to try to understand, but I'm not sure it's as impactful as some make out. Generally, that text is a repackaging of Maoist insurgency doctrine with jihadist, verbiage. They've took ideas from it, building pockets, etc., but it's not imaginative enough, and it doesn't really describe at all how to achieve what we talked about before, or what Mao would have considered to be phase 3, which is tamkin and beyond. So the rest, Nikaya, is something that's much more familiar in the doctrine, in jihadist theorists. And we talk about this a little bit in the book, particularly in our analysis of the Fallujah Memorandum, which is a strategy of from 2009, and even earlier was Zarqawi's early strategies, which were often critiqued, more about the terrorist targeting that he was doing, as opposed to what the strategies, the very familiar strategies, like Bloom's outbidding and these kind of the basic strategies that Gideon Walters talks about in the literature. Now, Zarqawi again put this into early practice with some knowledge of what they were doing, but they were criticized at the time because it took so long. And there's not, when you look at the type of attacks from whether they're insurgent attacks or terrorist attacks, they don't always make a lot of sense in the here and now. They have an attritional or a exhaustion function that is, it's difficult to decipher as you're looking at, and they were criticized for this. And it's interesting because the Dabik piece right here actually makes a critique of their rivals now who are doing Nikaya without any kind of purpose. So they're really talking about Jolani and their other rivals, when in reality they had to do the same thing. They were criticized for these attacks without a purpose, and yet they have a purpose. It's just the links between any particular attack and beyond are going to be difficult to establish until you're able to look back at it, and that's what we'll try to do here a little bit in this talk. One of the points I think about is everything they learned about being a global insurgent, and that's something that we're a focus for the talk today. They learned in the Iraq War. It was an ultimate multiplayer game. They were able to leverage the global organization at the time, Al Qaeda, which was organized and well financed, and to influence a local Islamist insurgency. However, at the local level, they went on their own way and developed their own techniques. And so what you see today is almost a hybrid of the two. Absorbing locals, so a mix of foreigners and locals dominating the local scene. That includes a lot of political violence directed at Islamist competitors. And that's something that they have kind of developed techniques for. They believe their doctrine is about winning local, and it's not necessarily about having a master plan as you would, but a grand strategy that directs expansion opportunistically, right? Based off of events that cannot be foreseen ahead of time. So for the next part, we'll look at the strategic and operational trends, look at some data just to show what the current status of the fight is, and try to strike a balance between this winning local and the global expansion, right? Those are it's almost a paradox that they're able to achieve or to kind of fight through, and a lot of that's based off of their competitive and coercive consolidation techniques in the local arenas. Some examples of that history are Iraq. They started as a small group of foreigners, and they eventually dominated the Sunni Iraqi resistance milieu, and were able to eventually consolidate Tamkin and create a caliphate in Iraq, while Syria is really forming it's a distraction from what's going on in Iraq at the time. Syria also serves as its first testing ground for expansion, helped by the fact that its logistics have run through it over a decade. They're quite familiar with it. And they're testing a lot of the techniques that they had learned in Iraq about how to deal with rivals. And here you have a hybrid mix of Iraqis and Syrians that are playing spoilers for Democrats, avoiding Assad, and working single-mindedly towards a political consolidation of a caliphate in Syria and in parts of Iraq. And they use this position to dominate foreign fighter flows, as we all understand, and that which its competitors largely failed to value. And this helps expand their external influence, and it plants the seeds for their global expansion. And you can see similar template taking place in with Afghanistan and the Philippines, how they're able to come in, establish themselves locally, and then work to try to dominate the local political scene. So if you look at, again, this is a graph of Islamic State reported attacks, their claimed attacks, and you can see it's fairly stable. It fluctuates between franchises. Some franchises like Iraq are still fairly robust compared to the others, although Afghanistan prior to this time period was pretty robust as well. You can see various, just parsing it in various ways, whether it's individual franchises, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, et cetera, or lethality, looking at different aspects. You can see a lot of fluctuation. And again, when you look at these, it really doesn't paint a picture for us that helps us understand how how they're influencing this global activity. But if we look back, one of the things I like to do is look back. If you look back, in the blue is their claims, which is similar to the claims that I just showed you. And you can see it's stable for a very long time, from 2008 really to the beginning of 2012. And then the activity picks up greatly. So there's some stored potential energy that I sense in this activity that is planned. It's a planned series of campaigns that build on each other, using Syria, to be sure, as both interior lines, but also bouncing back and forth between Iraq and Syria. You've got increased foreign fighter flows, as well as a lot of local recruitment happening in a time of more sectarian activity. So there's questions about why they should go global, but in reality, these are questions that they've been working on and answering for themselves for a very long time, long before 2014. And this is 2011 training. Most likely, some are foreign fighters. Still, the foreign fighter flow is picking up in Anbar in 2011, again after a down period, a long down period. And you can see Adnani, the spokesman, actually in the field training. But we're using this to talk about now that they've gone global, how are they expanding these models globally? And Haroro is going to talk more about that. But one, they're putting dedicated advisors into the field. We've seen evidence, some evidence of that in Afghanistan. It's hard to verify. But we have recent reports in West Africa of advisors on the ground sharing TTPs on securing leadership and succession, as Haroro talked about, media and military skills. We'll talk a little bit more about the media, like Haroro said, and bringing in financing, establishing financing flows that did not exist, let's say in West Africa again, before. And these are based off of their own connections. Again, the motivations behind this are still unclear on what they believe they're establishing in this global insurgency, if you will. All right, as we're calling it. So looking at structure, organizational and structure that support global expansion. One of the things here is media structure. You can see in 2007, it's pretty vanilla, even for an insurgent organization that's under a lot of pressure, but it's actually producing quite a bit of media, over 1,000 media products that appear on the internet and probably much more on the ground. The recent release of Al-Mallah's interrogation reports that Haroro and I worked on, and Haroro mentioned earlier, show the group is already putting Al-Furqan Media under the Mosul leadership, including the current caliph, and they're integrating Sharia members into this media center, most likely in that internal committee. You can see, even though the group has expanded into regional offices, which was something that had already started in 2007, you can see here a very centralized control structure now that's quite different than what we saw before, although the central media did mirror that to some degree that earlier, but they've expanded out, but they still have very centralized control. Then this is a more artistic representation, if you will, unverified, but generally shows the evolution of this structure into a has got a lot of diversity of people in it. It has security people in it, it has media people in it, and it has religious Sharia that are advising on the appropriateness of the media. And so this is just a depiction of what that might look like. And then again, the reason we're showing you this is what they're exporting, right? They're exporting ideas and tested models of structures that are not going to be adapted perfectly by the local affiliates, but they are models for them to adapt in the way that makes sense for them. This is what the Islamic State Department of Soldiers looks like in 2015 as best we can develop. This is a project that I'm working on right now that hopefully will be out. And it looks at a lot of Islamic State archival documents to show their organizational structure for their Department of Soldiers, the Department of Defense, if you will. And it looks like it's very structured when you put it on this chart. But if you look at how they operated in the field, and they have, again, Sharia in the headquarters. They have Sharia advisors in the military units at different levels, at levels that we've really never seen before in other, let's say, Islamic armies per se. And they serve a function much like political commissars did, but much different. It also functions as a professionalization agent, managing the soldiers ideologically, influencing them religiously, but also controlling things like finance, right? Crimes and the relationship with the populace, which is a very Maoist idea. By having them act appropriately according to the law, Islamic law, then that allows them to continue to expand their influence. But it controls problematic and very criminal practices like the slavery of the Yazidi. All right, so the importance of that is there. It can be seen here in these slides, but at the same time, this gives a perception that it's much more rigid than it probably really is. Because when you look at the armies of the caliphate, it's almost indecipherable why they have 4 different armies that fall under this headquarters unit, and it's all about how they originated. Let's say the foreign fighter battalions, if you will, for lack of a better term here, the Army of Dabiq, and you have specialized units in Mosul, and then you have the armies of the Walaya, which are really the local cells plus attached units, and then you have the Caliphate Army, which are actual units that are then subdivided and attached down to the armies of the Walaya. So there's quite a bit of complexity here that's very difficult to understand. Having spent the better part of 6 months trying to figure this out, I'm still not sure I do. And with that, I'll turn it over to Haroro to finish up this organizational trend portion of the talk.
Thanks. So just to, I guess, start to wrap up and head towards the counter strategy implications. One of the issues for us was, well, how do we conceptualize of this Islamic State movement from an organizational perspective? Organizationally, how do we think about this? Not just over time, this multi-decade history, but now. And the way that we describe it in this upcoming ICCT paper is the Islamic State as a global autocratic insurgency. Now, this idea of an adhocracy is really important for those of you who are interested. Mintzberg's work is quite instrumental in terms of the study. Adhocracies are characterized by a structure of kind of interacting project teams that tend to emerge in complex and kind of ever-changing environments. Other characteristics of an adhocracy that are important is that decisions tend to be made in a decentralized way, operationally and tactically, but a core leadership group, what Mintzberg describes as the strategic apex, will tend to direct strategic, ideological, and identity purpose for the larger organization. Adhocracies tend to be innovative, flexible, and adaptive to change, and they transition into different structures as conditions shift. Sometimes they'll be more hierarchical and formal and bureaucratic, but as conditions change, they will become more fluid and more network-like. Coordination tends to be through adherence to an overarching strategy or identity. But to keep that operational coherence going, adhocracies tend to be very reliant on communication technologies and the deployment of liaison teams and middle managers. So adhocracies have certain strengths in that they are innovative, they're flexible, they're designed to deal with change, but they also have weaknesses. They're heavily reliant on communication. If communication breaks down, then adhocracies are susceptible to tactical, operational, and even strategic incoherence that can result in the organization fraying and breaking up, fracturing. Adhocracies are susceptible to internal competition that can lead to extremism. It can lead to extremism in terms of operational activities, but it can also lead to extremism in an ideological sense as different parts of the organization try to do other parts of the organization, outdo other parts of the organization. Adhocracies can also too hastily transition. They try too hard to formalize and bureaucratize and they get themselves into trouble, or they try too rapidly to become informal, and it can leave them susceptible. And I think that hopefully as I'm describing this, as you look at Islamic State history, a lot of this, I suspect, will be resonating with you. The way that these strengths and weaknesses that characterize adhocracies have kind of tended to play out. And this understanding is going to be really important when we talk about the counter-strategy implications for how to confront organizations that are characterized by these autocratic traits. So I just want to move on to the transnational issues at the moment and just wrap up with a few quick reflections on Islamic State's transnational enterprise. What you have is a mix of top-down and bottom-up dynamics that are driving its transnational efforts. Those top-down are the Islamic State's push for global expansion. Those bottom-up factors are local groups seeking recognition and support, but are largely motivated by local factors. And these dynamics, these interaction of dynamics will have a push and pull effect on the organization, sometimes reinforcing and strengthening, other times straining and fracturing on a whole range of different issues. Now, this transnational push has been an issue of contention for the group. For some, it was representative of strength, it projected credibility. For others, it took resources and focus away from the heartlands. That by bringing in these provinces that had very little hope of achieving tamkeen, of consolidating, of establishing, of bureaucratizing, of bringing in such provinces, you kind of end up undermining these larger claims of credibility and authority. Now, the Islamic State established criteria for acceptance of affiliates in 2014, pledging to the caliph, applying the manhaj, accepting its aqidah, consolidating local groups under a single banner, establishing communications with central. But this has been inconsistently applied. And in 2018, what we saw was a rationalization of its transnational enterprise. Some provinces were brought together under a single banner, such as in Iraq and in Syria. whereas in other cases, aspiring groups that never reached the level of a formal province were kind of clumped together under a single banner. The Islamic State in East Asia is an example. The Islamic State of Central Africa province is another example. What's important about these dynamics is that we need to be thinking about these different provinces as sitting on a spectrum that reflects different degrees of command and control. It is wrong to apply the same criteria to every province and then dismiss certain provinces because they don't adhere to the standards of, say, the province in Iraq or Syria. I see this a lot on the issue, for example, of East Asia, the Philippines, where I spend a lot of time, but also on the issue of the Congo, for example. There are these debates that largely miss the point on what it is to be a formal affiliate. Secondly, the second issue that's important for us to think about is that the Islamic State have these really crucial exports that they provide to their broader transnational affiliates. And it's their Aqidah and their Manhaj. And what this provides is a way for locals to shape their activities, to rationalize and make sense of their activities. It provides a strategic lens and rationale for their operations. But what it also does is it provides the Islamic State's propaganda units with an almost never-ending pool of examples of what? Its Aqidah and its Manhaj being applied all around the world. And so these exports are really important for reinforcing both those top-down and bottom-up dynamics. What I'll do is I'll finish now by just very, very quickly addressing the counter-strategy implications. And in our paper, let's go to the next slide, we basically put forward a four-pillared strategy. We argue that while it is going to be necessary to have nuanced operational and strategic approaches at a local level, there needs to be an overarching understanding of the problem and guiding principles to cohere that effort. Our second pillar is degrade the Islamic State's primary exports. It is necessary to train local specialists in the Islamic State's Manhaj and Aqidah to remove that sense of surprise and confusion. Craig describes it as a symphony of violence, and I think that describes it perfectly. When you're in the middle of that symphony of violence, it's really hard to kind of recognize what is going on. By providing locals with a lens, it helps to shape how that's understood. The third pillar is we need to exploit those weaknesses that are inherent to an adhocracy, maintain that pressure, maintain the pressure during transition, maintain the pressure on communications, and that will exacerbate those weaknesses. There's extremism on its fringes. And finally, our efforts should be prioritized on locations where the Islamic State have been before. Why? Because that is where they will attempt to return. And so much of the work that Craig and I have done, for example, in the southern Philippines, is really focused on that, going back in the southern Philippines, going back into places like Lanao del Sur, but also into Maguindanao, the Zamboanga Peninsula, and into Sulu, and in a sense, trying to provide civil society there with the type of understanding that will help to push back against those legacy-based resurgent strategies of the Islamic State. And on that note, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you to you both for that excellent presentation. It leaves us just enough time to get to a few of the questions in our Q&A, and we do have a few of them, but I'll just abuse my position as moderator to ask the first one, which is taking a prompt from your learning from defeat, as well as the adhocracy model that you put forward. There's this kind of narrative or sense out there that the Islamic State, after losing its proto-state status, is an organization in crisis. So do you think that the Islamic State is an organization in crisis? And if it is, what can we learn and understand from its previous points of crisis in terms of giving us a window on how it might move forward, given the models that you've, doctrinal summaries that you've put forward to us?
Go ahead, Haroro. You want to take the first crack?
Sure. Look, is the Islamic State in crisis? I think that it has suffered devastating defeats in its heartlands. It has lost leaders. Its leadership has been devastated. You know, its middle managers, in particular, its commanders, have been devastated. Its resources, certainly, it has plenty of stores. There's no doubt about that. It has the strategic depth that kind of comes from having those transnational networks, but it is under an immense amount of pressure. And I think that some evidence of that is in this kind of leadership succession practice, and a lot of the way that people have kind of saw the potential rise of al-Mawla as indicative of an organization and certainly a command, a strategic apex that is struggling. It is absolutely essential to maintain this pressure. What does history tell us? History tells us that we pat ourselves on the back after defeating, and it is a defeat, of the formal, bureaucratized, hierarchical-looking Islamic State, only for it to return again. That phased politico-military strategy that Craig spoke about, that is so central to the way that we talk about, we assess the Islamic State in our book, and frankly, all our publications, is vital here, that it understands that it can move back down those phases. Not only is it not ashamed of that, it's proud of it. That is why the group can forecast, yeah, we're going to have to move back down. We're going to have to go back into the deserts again. And in this part of the world, we're going to have to go back into the jungles. That's just what we have to do. Because when you fight a forever war, which is what they are doing, when you fight a forever war, you need to have a strategy that that allows you to fight a war that is ongoing. And I think that that's what's really important here, is maintaining that pressure is essential. It doesn't take the same amount of resources and time and effort, blood and treasure, as it does when it's secured in territory. But it is going to be necessary to have a very kind of targeted approach to containing and essentially suffocating the Islamic State where it is. We recognize that the great power competition is now the #1 priority. We do not see the effort to counter the Islamic State as contrary to that. In fact, it can be a way in which to help to facilitate the kind of partnerships and alliances that will be necessary to push back on a rising East.
Yeah, really interesting point. So I might just turn to the Q&A from the audience members. One from Mia Bloom, where she asks, you know, usually leadership transitions offer other opportunities or multiple opportunities for rising challengers. Have we seen these kinds of splinters emerging in Islamic State yet, just beyond their kind of affiliate organizations?
I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to know, but what Haroro described as the leadership succession practice that they have instituted, they kind of theorized it themselves and have instituted it, and whether that's intuitive or they have, they understand, this idea of charismatic / routinization process, but the routinizations help them survive the catastrophe that you're talking about, both the last leadership success, the first succession of an actual declared caliph, and then their global franchises staying with them, which really might not have happened. That probably was very iffy. And I know we've got evidence that some of them were thinking about jumping ship at the time. So, though the development of that, I think is geared towards preventing what Mia's asking about, which is, rivals trying to use that opportunity to splinter the group or take it off. That I can think of, Jolani and Nusra were the only real splinter from the group that's based off of not really ideology, but much more about strategic differences about how to do that inter-jihadi competition. And Jolani grew up in the Islamic State, the early Islamic State of Iraq, and was a trusted member of it, but yet had very different ideas than not just Baghdadi, but also Abu Ali al-Anbari and the really core leadership of the Islamic State, all of them who are gone now, but certainly had an influence on al-Mawla, who's the current caliph. So I think that's not one of their weaknesses. You don't see a lot of splintering for them because of ideology, because of their very successful leadership practice and the repetitiveness, the cycling that they've gone through these models that have kind of built on each other.
Great.
And just to add very, very quickly, you know, it's an excellent question from Mia. It's a difficult question. Perhaps, you know, Craig and I are in the middle of writing a book on leadership succession, precisely this topic. And I think that Al-Qaeda, in fact, is a great example of where these processes of leadership succession in that charismatic vacuum that was left by the killing of bin Laden, how there were these fractures that kind of emerged all throughout Al-Qaeda, really, and the kind of challenges that emerge when you have this large network where leadership largely is based on charisma, that you're trying to out charismatically appeal to each other. And then when that central force, that central charismatic figure is removed, it's open season in terms of competition. You see that fracturing occurring there. I think Al-Qaeda is a good example of that.
Right. So I guess the next question is coming, talking about your points about localization. So the strategy of winning locals to spearhead global expansion resembles the strategy of organized crime groups in different parts of the world. This question is from Michelle Grossman. So how much of the playbook here is also drawn from insights around how transnational serious organized criminal enterprise operate in relation to territorial ambitions and power?
Yeah, I'll just say that the Islamic State can be looked at as an organized criminal organization. I mean, the discussion I had about inputting Sharia at all levels is because they're trying to regulate criminal activity amongst their normal members, just everyday members, soldiers. You know, most armies don't have problems with their soldiers. You know, they do commit war crimes, but they're not allowed to be involved in resource extraction, criminal activity. It's part of the model for resourcing the Islamic State. Paying soldiers comes out of all of really criminal activity. So I don't know, for Michelle's question, I don't know for sure, and Haroro, take a crack. There's no evidence that they've adopted these from, but it certainly looks the same. And all I could say is that the immense amount of criminal activity they're actually conducting on a day-to-day basis from the top of the organization all the way down, and who decides where these things go and how to generate new revenue sourcing, has to be a similarity there. There has to be parallels there that I just haven't ever seen any smoking guns on, like that's what they're doing intuitively. Haroro?
Yeah, I'm with Craig on this. It's, you know, the different places around the world where, you know, I've kind of traveled and worked with communities. I know Craig's, you know, what Craig was referring to there, and I know his experiences on the ground. It looks a hell of a lot like an organized crime network, and that's part of being a clandestine, violent underground movement, is that your options in terms of generating resources are going to be criminal activity because you are illegal. You have an illegal kind of status, and when you look at the way in which they've been able to manipulate this amongst local organizations. Take, for example, in the southern Philippines, again, a place where Craig and I have done quite a bit of work over the last couple of years. I mean, down in Sulu, the ABSAF group, you know, the kidnapping, the drug trade are a really important part of the way that organization generates funds. And so, and it's no different across the southern Philippines, really. Whether it's in Maguindanao or Lanao, that crime is central. That, though, is kind of inherent to being an illegal clandestine organization. So there is much to learn and take from those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, we've hit time, but if you don't mind staying just a few minutes, we actually have some really interesting questions in the Q&A. One of them is about Islamic State in the Philippines. And the question from Timothy Miller is what is your forecast from Islamic State in the Philippines, particularly the potential impacts to Western nations and interests? And sort of relatedly is a question from Vanessa Boralski. What are the implications for the developments that you're speaking about with the Islamic State for recruitment of people from the Western world? So forecast for Philippines and forecast for implications on radicalization and recruitment in the West.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to take the Southern Philippines question, Craig, if you want to take the second one.
Sure, go.
Look, this is, as I said, I mean, until COVID, I was traveling in the Southern Philippines, you know, every 4 to 6 weeks, you know. I spent a lot of time in kind of, well, particularly up around Marawi, but also down in Cotabato. There are really 3 channels of pro-Islamic State group activity in the Southern Philippines, which are really of great concern. One is through the Sulu Archipelago. You then move to Lake Lanao, which is in Lanao del Sur. That's the Dawla organization that you'll be aware of because of the Marawi siege. They're still active. And then there is the BIF that are operating, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, operating in Maguindanao. Really, while it is obviously natural to ask what is the transnational implications, I think that a nice place to start is what are the local implications. What you have in the Southern Philippines is an extraordinary opportunity with the establishment of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. You have the Bangsamoro government being established. From an outsider's perspective, looking at the Marawi siege, it looked like, well, here is the Islamic State, these top-down forces, the Islamic State moving into Marawi. From a local perspective, their sense was that these were young, mostly men, but also women, who were seeking to demonstrate to the local population that there was an alternative to this kind of, not my language, but largely theirs, this sycophancy, this weakness of going to peace after decades, centuries of war against the Christian Manila and its other kind of foreign supporters. And so, so much of the dynamics in those 3 channels has been really driven by largely local factors, principally the ongoing peace process. The success of that peace process, the success of the Bangsamoro government will be absolutely essential. In the lead up to the elections in the next year or 2, it is going to be vital that it is successful, because what you have is the implementation of a system of government where people can vote for political change, and it is not, you know, that there are peaceful pathways for expression and for political change. If the Bangsamoro government fails, the effect for stability in Mindanao will be absolutely devastating. The pro-Islamic State groups will be able to come back with the favorite line of the Islamic State anywhere in the world, which is, "I told you so." And in Southern Philippines, you also have the communist insurgency just to the north there as well, which is an additional concern. And that the constant pool of poverty, clan conflict, and organized crime. I don't mean to place it all on one issue, but the success of the peace process will be absolutely essential to confronting the pro-Islamic State groups and ultimately towards moving to something that vaguely resembles stability. And that will, of course, then have positive domino effects for kind of regional stability. But there's every reason to be positive, there's equally every reason to be very concerned about what's happening in the Southern Philippines at the moment.
And Craig, do you want to take that question about implications for the West and potentials for recruitment and radicalization in the West?
Specifically from the Philippines, or is this could this be anywhere?
No, anywhere. So broadly with
broadly. Okay, got it. Thank you for the clarification. That's a really interesting question. I don't have the answer to that. I've been wrong a lot about this group. I did my PhD dissertation on this group in 2014, so I've been thinking about it for a little bit, but I've been wrong quite a few times. Global expansion, the the ambitions of their global expansion, I was, completely wrong on. And I also thought that in a, again, hope to be hope to be right on this, but I could be wrong, is that there was a bow wave of external operations that would happen while there's a caliphate, but once the caliphate was crushed, and it was clear it was going to be crushed as early as 2015-ish, 2016 for sure, and that the Iraqis had the political will to actually help collapse that, and then the Americans were able to develop a proxy that was actually going to be efficient enough to destroy it in Syria, that would create a really kind of a, let the air out of the balloon, if you will. But you're starting to see, that residual external, attacks, and certainly some of them are exaggerated. Some of them are claimed post facto, and they really are not even influenced. The ones in France, I think, particularly, and others are very opportunistic. Now they're, kind of, this idea of bandwagoning or whatever. I mean, Mia probably could explain that dynamic way better than I could.
Well,
But
they only claimed one attack, isn't that right?
yeah, and so, and even then they've, how much they had to work to do that. So, but I'm still hoping that with the absence of a caliphate, the problem is that they're working very hard. There's a couple other questions about territory. How important is Syria or any of these other places? Again, I don't see them having a master plan or something like management of savagery. Like, these are the countries on the list. Like, they are opportunistic, so they're going into the places that, Congo and Mozambique are the best examples. Like, when no one would have foreseen that, but they're just kind of following the trail of instability and criminal activity, like you guys were talking about. And then that is what the implications are for us. And I think people understand we've kind of been burned by this group a couple of times now, but letting our guard down. And so I think, the good news is we will probably be a lot more. Look at us now. We're still alert to the fact that they are a thing, and they produce a danger to all of us. And great power competition, I think, has the potential to really open up a lot of space while people are focused on, the Cold War was a great example of that, where, our interests in stability in Africa are not as important as, just defeating the Soviets there, for whatever reason. And then the consequences of that, we still feel to this day. And so I'm worried about, actors like that getting in there. And we didn't have these third party actors per se in the Cold War that were like the Islamic State. We had third world, not third world, but we had non-associated, non-aligned states, but they weren't, trying to throw a monkey wrench into the other two, behemoths, if you will. So it's different.
Yeah, well, your point about territory is interesting. It's a perfect segue to our final question, because we're well over time. Is that this comes from Sarah. She said, if their war is not secured in territory, how important is El Shem to them?
Go ahead, Haroro.
I mean, Syria will remain pretty essential to. I mean, this is the heartlands, really, and so much of its core leadership, the core of the group, they are Syrian, and so Syria is going to be important. Syria remains unstable, and so Syria is going to be a fertile environment for the Islamic State. The border, that very porous border between Iraq and Syria, is going, that in a sense kind of helps to create some very practical ground level flexibility for the Islamic State movement. Using border jurisdictions to kind of make it more difficult for their adversaries to confront them. It is important for us to recognise, however, that look, territory is important to the Islamic State. Having territory, controlling land and populations is important to the Islamic State, and it will always be a goal for the movement. We need to be very careful not to kind of drift too far with this argument where we start to talk about, this idea that, oh, they'll be satisfied living on the internet. I mean, that's largely been proven to be rubbish. It was rubbish at the time. It remains rubbish. It will, for the foreseeable future, be rubbish. What is absolutely crucial is how does it transfer into the real. This is an organization that is interested in surviving for all the ideas, and there's a lot of cute kind of cliched lines that come, oh, you can't kill an idea and all the rest of it. No, we need to focus on what's tangible here. This movement is made of human beings. And it's those human beings who have driven this movement forward, quite brilliant human beings who've been able to drive this movement forward, to push its strategy forward. And I've always found that, my last point, I've always found that useful as a practitioner. It's been useful for me to remember that this isn't some monolith, some abstract force that is devastating communities around the world. There are human beings here, and we've got to think about it this way, that we've got to outcompete those human beings and be smarter and more creative and engaging with these communities that matter. And I think that a big part of what's important about research, important about our understanding, is not just how it shapes response, but how it shapes our mentality as individuals, but also the culture within our teams about how we approach these issues. And so, I think that understanding the interconnectedness of all of these themes and issues is really important. Craig, do you have any final?
Yeah, about Syria, I mean, I completely agree. It's, they're accused of rushing in to grab territory, and that's not, I don't think that's true. They're very patient about developing it, and they'll control territory where they can in very small pockets. They tried to do it early in the Iraq War, very early in the Iraq War, when they were Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it was fantastical, but they were still trying to do it, and it allows them to develop practice and stuff. But they just as easily can give it up. They'll just as easy give that up and then go somewhere else that's easier to do it. And Syria, I mean, the really interesting thing from the Syria perspective is you had Syrians fighting in Iraq in those early years, and they're always looking back behind them saying, when are we going to take this to Syria, which is what they really want to do. And the organization, the large organization, saying the fight is here, and that's where you're going to fight, and they're good with that. But they talk about it a lot, and you saw that in some of their propaganda early on. Like in 2012, they have Syrians doing raids in Iraq. Now this is during the Syrian civil war, right? And yet they still are able. It's almost like they're saying, like, the point is you're going to fight where we want you to fight, or where the best places to fight, and sometimes that's going to be Iraq, even for the Syrians. And so I've always thought that was really interesting. And they actually showed that in their propaganda. These are Syrians who died in Iraq during the Syrian stuff. But at the end of the day, like Haroro said, they have a vested, it's very important to them from a legitimacy perspective to be involved in Syria. And it's also a place that's unstable, like Haroro said, and they're gonna watch and wait for opportunities, like their sponsor leaving the area, which is what happened in Iraq in 2011, and they were able to generate from there.
Yeah, really good point from both of you. Such interesting stuff. And because it is so interesting, I utterly failed in my task as moderator and put us well over, but it is because it has been such a granular and interesting perspective that you guys offer us. So I want to thank you sincerely, especially Craig, making the time with the different time zones from California, and Haroro. I urge you to check out the ISIS Reader. I know for us here in Australia, it's available through amazon.com.au and also Booktopia. I was able to get a copy through there. I'd also like to take the opportunity before we end to inform everyone of our upcoming AVERT seminar. And we're lucky to have Dr. John Horgan join us, and his webinar is going to be on terrorism, tornado genesis, a multi-level, multi-role, multi-mechanism socio-psychological model of terrorism and its participants. That's quite a mouthful, but seems fascinating. So I urge you to join us for our upcoming AVERT webinar on that. It's going to be on November 19th. The details of it are on the AVERT website, which is avert.net.au, where you can also find more information about the AVERT network. Thank you so much again, Haroro and Craig, Charlie in absentia. We're always thinking of him, the other co-author of the ISIS reader. Thank you again.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks for hosting this. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually.
See you.
Been following your work for a long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Haroro. Bye-bye.